Queen Mary's son who abdicated was Edward VIII, not Edward VII. Edward VII was her father-in-law, and he died on the 6th of May, 1910. If a video can't get basic regnal numbers right, why would you trust anything else it tells you? And that's the problem. The internet is drowning in videos about Queen Mary of Teck, grandmother of Elizabeth II, and most of them are rubbish. They confuse grandfathers with grandsons. They quote letters out of context. They call a grieving mother cold without understanding what she actually witnessed. They accuse her of having blood on her hands for decisions she had no constitutional power to make. They reduce a woman who lived through 2 world wars, an abdication crisis, and the transformation of an empire into a cartoon villain suitable for 10-minute clickbait. You've probably watched some of these videos. You've probably sat there thinking, this doesn't sound right. Something's off. The dates don't line up. The framing feels cheap. You are correct. So let's do this properly. Not a biography. You can find those anywhere. This is a correction. A reckoning with the lazy storytelling that's turned a complex historical figure into clickbait fodder. Queen Mary deserves better, and frankly, so do you. The basics first. Victoria, Mary, Augusta, Louise, Olga, Pauline, Claudine, Agnes of Teck was born on the 26th of May, 1867, at Kensington Palace. Her father held a morganatic title from Württemberg, meaning his marriage was considered beneath his station, which left his children in an awkward position. Royal enough to live among Europe's grandest families, not wealthy enough to sustain themselves independently. The future Queen Mary grew up in what we might call genteel poverty, acutely aware that her family's position depended entirely on the favor of their British royal relations. This precariousness shaped everything about the woman she became. She learned early that survival required strategy, that favor could evaporate, that nothing was guaranteed. When critics later called her cold or calculating, they were seeing the habits of someone who had spent her childhood understanding that one wrong step could mean ruin. She was engaged to Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence, eldest son of the future Edward VII. He died of influenza on the 14th of January, 1892, 6 weeks before their wedding. The following year, she married his younger brother George, Duke of York, who had become the new heir presumptive. Some videos treat this as scandalous. It wasn't. It was practical Victorian problem-solving by a family that had already invested significantly in the match. Queen Victoria herself encouraged it. But here's what matters for our purposes. George became King George V on the 6th of May, 1910, when Edward VII died. Mary became Queen Consort, the wife of a reigning king, a title carrying ceremonial duties but absolutely no constitutional authority. Remember that phrase, no constitutional authority. It becomes important later. It becomes important repeatedly. George and Mary had 6 children between 1894 and 1905. The eldest, born the 23rd of June, 1894, was Edward Albert Christian George Andrew Patrick David. This child grew up to become King Edward VIII. He was 15 years old when his grandfather, Edward VII, died in 1910. He would not abdicate until 1936. 26 years later, at the age of 42. The competitor videos that confuse Edward VII with Edward VIII are not making a minor slip about Roman numerals. They are confusing a man who died in 1910 with his grandson, who wasn't even king until 1936. A grandfather who ruled for 9 years and died in his bed. A grandson who ruled for 326 days and gave up his throne for an American divorcee. 2 completely different people living in different centuries of their family's history. If someone can't keep these 2 men straight, why would you trust their interpretation of anything else? Why would you believe them when they tell you what kind of mother Mary was, or what she felt about her children, or what she did during a political crisis? You wouldn't, and you shouldn't have. Before we get to the accusations, let's establish what Queen Consort actually meant in practice. Because the clickbait videos never explain this. They just assume queen equals power and move on. On the 12th of December 1911, Mary participated in one of the most spectacular displays of imperial pageantry ever staged. The Delhi Durbar. George V had decided to announce his succession as King Emperor to the assembled princes of India in person, the first and only British monarch to attend his own Durbar. The logistics were staggering. An entire temporary city was constructed outside Delhi to house the event. 40,000 British and Indian troops participated in the ceremonies. The temperature in December averaged around 23 degrees Celsius, comfortable by Indian standards, punishing for British officials in full ceremonial dress. The crowds numbered in the hundreds of thousands. There was a problem, though. The crown jewels of England cannot legally leave British soil. The imperial state crown, the one used at coronations and the state opening of Parliament, was locked in the Tower of London. George V couldn't wear it to his own Durbar, so they made a new one. The imperial crown of India was created specifically for this single occasion. It contained over 6,000 diamonds, along with emeralds, rubies, and sapphires. The central stone was a massive emerald of 34.4 carats. The crown weighed approximately 34.05 ounces, slightly heavier than the imperial state crown itself. George V wore it exactly once, for those few hours in Delhi on that December day. Then it went into storage at the Tower of London, where it remains to this day, never to be worn again. A crown made for a single afternoon. And Mary? She stood beside her husband in temperatures that left European attendees wilting, wearing formal robes and a crown of her own, participating in ceremonies that lasted hours. This was the job. Not power, performance. Not authority, visibility. The queen consort was a symbol, expected to embody imperial dignity while possessing no mechanism to influence imperial policy. When critics accuse Mary of failing to act in various crises, they're accusing her of not exercising power she literally did not have. The Delhi Durbar shows you what her role actually was. Stand in the heat, wear the crown, represent the institution. Nothing more. Let's talk about Prince John. John Charles Francis was born on the 12th of July, 1905, the youngest of 6 children. Around the age of 4, he began experiencing seizures. The diagnosis was epilepsy. Modern medical historians examining the historical record suggest he may also have been on the autism spectrum, though no formal diagnostic criteria existed for that in 1909. What became clear over the following years was that John's epilepsy was what physicians now call refractory or intractable. His seizures did not respond to treatment. They would never respond to treatment. There was no treatment that could make them respond. To understand what Queen Mary faced, you have to understand how limited medical options were in the 1910s. The primary medication available was potassium bromide, which had significant sedative side effects and often failed to control severe cases. Phenobarbital became available around 1912, but it too was of limited effectiveness for truly intractable seizures. There were no anticonvulsant medications as we know them today, no surgical interventions, no vagus nerve stimulators, no ketogenic diet protocols, no MRI scans to identify lesions, no genetic testing to understand underlying causes. A child with refractory epilepsy in 1915 faced a reality of repeated, unpredictable, and often violent convulsions that left them exhausted, confused, and unable to maintain normal routines. The seizures could strike without warning. They could cause falls, injuries, aspiration of food or saliva into the lungs. Each episode carried risks that modern medicine has only partially mitigated even today. By his early teens, Prince John was experiencing multiple severe episodes daily. Not weekly, daily. Each seizure carried risks of physical injury, aspiration, and a phenomenon called sudden, unexpected death in epilepsy, SUDEP, which remains a leading cause of death in people with uncontrolled seizures to this day. SUDEP occurs when someone with epilepsy dies unexpectedly and no other cause of death can be found. It can happen during sleep. It can happen after a seizure. It can happen without warning. Every day that John lived with uncontrolled seizures was a day his family lived with the knowledge that he might not survive to the next. In 1916, when John was 11, he was moved to Wood Farm on the Sandringham estate. He lived there with his devoted nanny, Charlotte Lala Bill, and a small, dedicated staff. His grandmother, Queen Alexandra, lived nearby at Sandringham House and saw him frequently. His mother wrote to him. His family visited. This wasn't exile. This was medically necessary care in an era before specialized residential facilities for epileptic children existed. Wood Farm provided the quiet, structured environment his condition demanded. Loud noises, crowds, overstimulation. These could trigger seizures. The formal demands of royal life were medically contraindicated for a child in John's condition. The decision to keep John's condition private was consistent with how all medical matters were handled among the upper classes at the time. Discretion about health wasn't a special cruelty reserved for disabled children. It was universal. The king himself had health problems that were never publicly discussed. The idea that medical conditions should be shared with the public simply did not exist in that era. Prince John died on the 18th of January, 1919, following a severe seizure. He was 13 years old. And here's where the viral videos twist the knife. Queen Mary wrote that John's death was a great release for him. The clickbait creators present this as proof of maternal coldness, a smoking gun revealing a monster who never loved her son. They are wrong. Profoundly, fundamentally wrong. Modern psychology recognizes relief at death as a normal and healthy component of grief when the deceased experienced prolonged suffering. Hospice workers know this. Palliative care specialists know this. Grief counselors know this. The technical term is anticipatory grief, the process of mourning that begins before death actually occurs, when you know your loved one is going to die and there is nothing you can do to stop it. Loving family members often feel profound relief when someone they love is no longer in pain. This doesn't indicate a lack of love, it indicates the opposite. Only someone who had witnessed and agonized over their loved one's suffering could feel such relief at its cessation. The relief doesn't mean you're glad they're dead. It means you're glad they're not suffering anymore. These are not the same thing, and anyone who has watched a parent with dementia or a child with terminal cancer understands the distinction viscerally. Mary watched her son endure thousands of seizures over 9 years. Thousands. She knew there would never be improvement, only decline. When death finally came, her acknowledgement that it was a release spoke to the depth of her grief, not its absence. Any caregiver who has sat beside someone they love while that person suffered, truly suffered, day after day with no prospect of recovery, understands exactly what Mary meant. The relief doesn't replace the grief. It exists alongside it, tangled up with it, inseparable from it. Taking those words and using them as evidence of coldness isn't just inaccurate, it's cruel. It's weaponizing a grieving mother's honesty against her. It's punishing her for articulating something that every hospice nurse in the world would recognize as completely normal. You suspected this framing was unfair. You were right. Now, the Romanovs. This is the most emotionally charged accusation against Queen Mary. The story goes like this. King George V was the first cousin of Tsar Nicholas II. George refused to offer asylum when the Russian Revolution broke out in 1917. Therefore, George and Mary bear moral responsibility for the execution of Nicholas, Alexandra, and their 5 children in Ekaterinburg on the 17th of July, 1918. Some commenters have called this framing slander. The truth is more complicated than either camp admits. First, the genealogy. Some videos claim George and Nicholas were related through Queen Victoria. Not quite. The relationship ran through their mothers, both daughters of King Christian IX of Denmark. George V's mother was Alexandra of Denmark. Nicholas II's mother was Dagmar of Denmark, who became Empress Maria Feodorovna of Russia. This made George and Nicholas first cousins through the Danish royal house, sharing Christian IX as their grandfather. The physical resemblance between them was so striking, they were frequently mistaken for one another in photographs. Both had inherited the features of the Danish royal line. When you see pictures of them together, you can barely tell them apart. Same beard, same eyes, same bone structure. So yes, they were genuine family. Close family. Family who looked like twins. Nicholas II himself was not a descendant of Queen Victoria. His wife, Empress Alexandra Feodorovna, was Victoria's granddaughter, making Victoria the great-grandmother of the Romanov children. But Nicholas came from a different line entirely. Getting these relationships right matters because the viral videos often don't, and confusion about who was related to whom leads to confusion about who bears responsibility for what. When the February Revolution of 1917 forced Nicholas to abdicate, the provisional government indicated the family would be permitted to leave Russia. The British government, headed by Prime Minister David Lloyd George, formally extended an offer of asylum in March 1917. An offer extended, but asylum never granted. Here's where the political calculus becomes impossible. Britain was locked in the 3rd year of a catastrophic war that had already killed hundreds of thousands of soldiers. The Somme had been fought the previous summer. Passchendaele was still to come. Every week brought casualty lists that filled newspaper columns. There was significant public sympathy for the Russian Revolution, which many saw as a democratic uprising against autocratic tyranny. A tyranny that had sent millions of Russian soldiers to die poorly equipped and poorly led. The working classes, whose sons were dying in trenches, did not wish to see their tax money spent housing a foreign despot who had lost his throne through incompetence. Lloyd George's coalition government included labor members actively hostile to sheltering the Tsar. Republican sentiment was more vocal in 1917 than at any point in Victoria's long reign. There had been actual discussions, quiet ones, behind closed doors, but real, about whether Britain needed a monarchy at all. The political situation was a tinderbox. One wrong move, and the spark could spread. And here is where constitutional reality becomes crucial. George V was a constitutional monarch, not an absolute ruler. He could not simply decree that Nicholas would be welcome in Britain. The decision to accept politically controversial refugees was a matter for the elected government. The Crown acts on the advice of ministers. This isn't a technicality, it's the foundation of the entire British system of government. Lloyd George's cabinet was divided, with some members warning that bringing Nicholas to Britain could destabilize the British monarchy itself by associating it with autocracy at a moment when democratic ideals were ascendant. The evidence suggests George V initially supported the asylum offer, but grew increasingly concerned about the political ramifications as weeks passed. His private secretary, Lord Stamfordham, communicated these concerns to the government. By April 1917, just weeks after the initial offer, the momentum had shifted. The government quietly withdrew the offer. Nicholas and his family remained in Russia as the situation deteriorated, eventually falling into Bolshevik hands after the October Revolution. Which brings us to Queen Mary. As Queen Consort, she had no constitutional authority whatsoever. None. She could advise her husband privately, But she held no vote in cabinet meetings, no command over policy, no lever to pull that would have opened Britain's doors. She wasn't in the room when these decisions were made. She wasn't consulted by the cabinet. She wasn't asked for her opinion by Lloyd George. The historical record contains no evidence that Mary actively lobbied against asylum. The evidence points to political forces far beyond anything she could have influenced. Forces controlled by elected politicians and constitutional conventions that explicitly excluded her from decision-making. To say she has blood on her hands is to attribute to her a power she never possessed. It's like blaming the queen in a chess game for a move made by the rooks. Does this mean the British royal family is blameless? No, they could have done more. George V could have pushed harder, made it a matter of personal honor, forced the government's hand, threatened to make the disagreement public. The fact that he didn't, that he allowed political convenience to override family obligation, remains one of the moral stains of the era. It haunted George V for the rest of his life. It should have. But that stain belongs primarily to the politicians who withdrew the offer and the king who let them do it. Not to the queen consort who possessed no constitutional mechanism to override either. The videos that blame Mary specifically are historically indefensible. They're looking for a villain and finding the easiest target rather than engaging with the complicated truth. You can judge the British response to the Romanov crisis harshly. You can argue they should have risked more, pushed harder, accepted the political costs. That's a legitimate moral position. What you can't do, not honestly, is pin it on Mary of Teck. Now let's talk about what the clickbait videos conveniently ignore, what Queen Mary actually did during the First World War. While her husband navigated the impossible politics of the Russian asylum question, Mary was engaged in practical work on an enormous scale. She became the driving force behind the Queen's Work for Women Fund, established in August 1914 to provide employment for women displaced by the economic disruption of wartime. She visited hospitals. She visited factories. She visited training programs for nurses and volunteers. But her most significant contribution was the expansion of the Queen's Needlework Guild, which she had been involved with since the 1890s. Under her leadership during the war years, the Guild coordinated the production of millions of garments for soldiers, refugees, and hospitals. This wasn't ceremonial ribbon cutting. This was logistics. Mary personally oversaw the collection and distribution of clothing, bandages, and supplies. She standardized patterns so that volunteers across the country could produce items that would actually be useful. She tracked inventory. She solved supply chain problems. The woman the internet portrays as a cold, distant aristocrat was spending her days elbow deep in the practical details of wartime relief. Not because she had to. A queen consort could have limited herself to formal appearances, but because she believed that royal privilege carried an obligation to practical service. Here's something else the videos miss entirely. Queen Mary's relationship with her second son, Albert, the future King George VI. Albert had struggled with a severe stammer from childhood. In an era when public speaking was an essential function of royal duty, this was not merely embarrassing, it was professionally debilitating. His father, George V, was often impatient with him. The pressure to perform, combined with the anxiety that made the stammer worse, created a vicious cycle that left Albert convinced he was inadequate for public life. Mary's approach was different. While never the warmly demonstrative mother that modern parenting standards would prescribe, she consistently supported Albert's efforts to overcome his speech difficulties. When he eventually began working with the Australian speech therapist Lionel Logue in 1926, Mary encouraged the treatment and followed his progress. She understood that her second son, who had never expected to be king, who had been raised as a spare, was going to need support when his elder brother Edward inevitably created problems. And create problems Edward did. In December 1936, Queen Mary faced another impossible situation. Her eldest son, now King Edward VIII, wished to marry Wallis Simpson, an American still married to her second husband. Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin informed the king that the British public would not accept a twice-divorced American as queen. The Dominion governments indicated they would not support the marriage either. On the 11th of December, 1936, Edward VIII signed the Instrument of Abdication. 326 days as king. Gone. The shortest reign since Lady Jane Grey in 1553, if you don't count disputed successions. Mary's second son, Albert, who had never expected to be king, who struggled with that severe stammer, who had none of his elder brother's glamour or ease with crowds, was thrust onto the throne as King George VI. The brother who had worked so hard to overcome his limitations. The brother Mary had quietly supported through years of speech therapy. Now he had to be king because his elder brother had chosen love over duty. Mary was devastated, not by sentiment, but by what she saw as a catastrophic failure of duty. She reportedly told Edward that she could not comprehend how anyone could abandon duty for personal desire. She refused to receive Wallis Simpson. She never relented on this point. When Edward visited England in later years, Mary would see him. He was still her son. But she would not extend that courtesy to the woman for whom he had thrown away his crown. Some videos present this as further evidence of coldness. That interpretation misses everything. Mary of Teck grew up in precarious circumstances, knowing her family's survival depended on royal favor. She spent her entire adult life watching the institution of monarchy navigate existential threats. 2 world wars, the collapse of empires, the rise of republicanism across Europe. She watched the German Kaiser, the Russian Tsar, the Austro-Hungarian Emperor, all lose their thrones. She understood in her bones that royal survival required sacrifice, restraint, and the subordination of personal happiness to institutional necessity. Edward choosing love over crown wasn't romantic to her. It was an existential threat to everything she'd spent her life protecting. Her reaction was the reaction of someone who understood the stakes better than her son apparently did. Cold or clear-eyed? You can decide for yourself. But at least now you have the context. There's another element of Queen Mary's reputation that the videos handle badly. Her collecting. Some content creators describe her as a kleptomaniac who acquired antiques from nervous hosts during her visits to stately homes. The story goes that Mary would admire an object so pointedly that the owner felt obligated to offer it as a gift. What a lovely snuff box! Such craftsmanship! One doesn't see work like this anymore. Hint, hint. The object would be wrapped and sent to the palace the next day. This narrative is largely exaggerated, but it's not entirely invented. Mary was indeed a serious collector of antiques, particularly items connected to the Stuart period and the British royal family's history. She did acquire many objects over her lifetime. She did have a habit of expressing admiration for things she liked. But here's what the clickbait versions leave out. She also paid for much of what she collected. She returned items when she learned the circumstances of their acquisition had been awkward. She was a serious scholar of decorative arts, not merely a magpie. And many of the items she acquired were things that owners genuinely wanted to give to the royal collection, understanding that objects of historical significance to the crown were better housed at the palace than in private hands. Was she pushy? By some accounts, yes. Was she a thief? No. The truth is more complicated and less sensational than the videos suggest, which is exactly why they simplify it. And while we're on jewelry, let's talk about something the videos get completely wrong when they mock her as a gem hoarder. Granny's chips. That's the nickname Queen Elizabeth II gave to 2 of the most significant diamonds in the royal collection, Cullinan III and Cullinan IV. Mary wore them constantly, either as a brooch or suspended from other pieces. They became so associated with her that generations later, Elizabeth still called them by that affectionate name. The Cullinan diamond was discovered in South Africa in 1905, the largest gem-quality rough diamond ever found, weighing 3,106 carats before cutting. The Transvaal government purchased it and presented it to King Edward VII on his 66th birthday in 1907. Edward commissioned the famous Asher brothers of Amsterdam to cut it, a process that took 8 months and produced 9 major stones plus 96 smaller brilliants. Cullinan I, the great star of Africa at 530.2 carats, was set in the sovereign's scepter. Cullinan II, the second star of Africa at 317.4 carats, was set in the imperial state crown. But Mary's favorites were Cullinan III, a pear-shaped diamond of 94.4 carats, and Cullinan IV, a cushion-shaped stone of 63.6 carats. In 1910, Mary had these 2 stones set together as a brooch. She wore it with everything. It appears in photograph after photograph throughout her decades as Queen Consort and Queen Dowager. The combined weight of those 2 diamonds, 158 carats just in the brooch, would be worth somewhere in the range of £50 million today, possibly more. When Elizabeth II inherited the piece, she wore it just as often as her grandmother had. The diamonds that had rested on Mary's chest for 40 years continued their journey on Elizabeth's for another 70. Continuity made physical. History you could pin to your lapel. The videos that sneer about Mary's collecting never mention this. They never explain that her acquisitions included preserving some of the most historically significant gems in existence for future generations. They never acknowledge that Granny's chips remained in the family, a tangible link between past and present, rather than being broken up or sold off. Collecting isn't hoarding when the collection serves institutional continuity. Mary understood this. Her critics don't. Here's something every competitor video has missed completely. In the comment sections of Queen Mary content, viewers keep asking about the same thing: the physical resemblance between Queen Mary and her descendants. Princess Charlotte, Queen Elizabeth II. No video has touched this, not one. Queen Mary possessed what royal watchers and portraitists of her era described as a notably strong facial structure. Her jaw was squared and defined, her cheekbones pronounced, her brow straight and classical. These weren't soft, rounded features typical of Victorian beauties. They were architectural, almost sculptural. Look at photographs of the young Mary of Teck before the elaborate hairstyles and formidable gowns she became famous for. The fundamental geometry of her face is unmistakable. Now look at photographs of the young Princess Elizabeth in the 1930s and 1940s. The angle of the jaw, the prominence of the cheekbones, the set of the eyes. This isn't coincidence, it's inheritance. Specific skeletal structure defining how the face appears at every stage of life. Elizabeth II was often compared to her father, George VI, but the underlying architecture came from her grandmother. As Elizabeth aged, this resemblance became more pronounced, not less. The older Queen Elizabeth II looked more like Queen Mary than the younger Elizabeth had. The bone structure that had been obscured by youth became more visible as the soft tissue thinned with age. And now there's Princess Charlotte, born in 2015. Royal watchers started commenting on the resemblance almost immediately. The shape of her face, the proportions of her features, the way her bone structure develops as she moves through childhood. It echoes photographs of Queen Mary as a young girl with remarkable precision. When you look at Charlotte, you're looking at Queen Mary's legacy made flesh. A woman who died 70 years ago, living on in the face of a great-great-granddaughter she never knew. History books will tell you Mary left behind a reformed monarchy, a stabilized succession, a legacy of duty over desire. That's all true, but she also left this, something visible, something tangible. Her face, passing through Elizabeth II, arriving in a child growing up in the 21st century. The videos that reduce her to a cold mother and a Romanov villain aren't just wrong about the facts. They're missing the forest for the trees. They're so busy constructing a monster, They can't see the woman who shaped the royal family in ways that are still visible today. So where does this leave us? Queen Mary of Teck died on the 24th of March, 1953, at Marlborough House, 10 weeks before her granddaughter's coronation. She was 85 years old. She left instructions that the coronation of Elizabeth II must proceed even if she died beforehand. The ceremony must not be delayed by mourning for her. Duty first, always, even in death. She was the only Queen Dowager in British history to live to see her grandchild become Queen Regnant. She had watched the institution she devoted her life to survive world wars, abdication, the collapse of empire, the transformation of Britain from the center of the world's largest empire to a diminished but still significant power. She had buried a son who suffered for 13 years and found the honesty to call his death a release. She had stood by while her family was blamed for a political decision they didn't actually have the power to make. She had supported a stammering second son through years of struggle, then watched him become king because his elder brother couldn't keep his priorities straight. And through it all, she maintained the dignity, restraint, and absolute commitment to duty that she believed, correctly as it turned out, would be what kept the monarchy alive. Was she warm by modern standards? No. Was she a monster? Absolutely not. She was a woman of her time, navigating impossible situations with the tools available to a royal consort who possessed influence but no power, visibility but no authority, expectations but no constitutional mechanism to meet them. She made choices that can be criticized. She had flaws that can be examined. But she deserves examination by people who know what they're talking about, not by content creators who can't tell Edward VII from Edward VIII. The viral videos got it wrong. You suspected they did. Now you know. If you want more content that gets the facts right, that respects your intelligence and doesn't insult your knowledge, subscribe. More stories like this one coming.